Welcome everyone to the Edith Wheeler Memorial Library. This is the second installment of Arthur Gottlieb's James Monroe, A Historical Perspective. I would like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsor for this program, the Monroe Historical Society. Now, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Arthur Gottlieb.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you. I have today's is our second session, and so we're going to be talking right now about James Monroe and the Revolutionary Era, as I've got the syllabus down. Right. So last week we had introduction. Today is James Monroe and the Revolutionary Era. Next time we'll talk about Monroe's first presidential term, 1817 to 1821. And then the following program will be the second presidential term, 1821 to 1825. And then finally, James Monroe's legacy and contemporary considerations, which is always important, especially right now or in the last few years where we've had pretty much a reevaluation of the people of the founding generation and the people who fought and studied and made policy during that era, of course. And we also have the overlap in this particular case because the event of this program is to commemorate the founding of the town of Monroe, which occurred in 1823 and of course bears Monroe's name. So as far as our Revolutionary Era, any of you have seen my Revolutionary program? I don't want to have a redo of that, but I'll give us some highlights as it has to do with James Monroe. And in a lot of cases, James Monroe was like a lot of other, call it what you want, red-blooded, young men of the day. And he heard the call to fight in the revolution, and he went and he did that. It was an inspirational thing, and to fight the British, it was for at least some people. In James Monroe's aspect of things, and one of the influences he had was from his own father, right? So James Monroe, born on April 28th, 1758, to the family of Spence Monroe. There was no such thing as called the middle class back in those days, but that's what this would have been. A plantation who owned a small plantation, a small one. And he was a planter. That's what they called themselves, a planter. And Monroe's father, Spence, was actively boycotted all British wares and goods. And in order to protest England's colonial practices, which in the proper turn of that would have been tyranny. You see, we considered that the abuse of power by the colonial governments, and in other words, Great Britain or Parliament, was tyrannical over these colonies, right? And so James Monroe's father believed that the England was being, in fact, tyrannical, and that was clearly an influence on James Monroe. You'll think about the kind of, remember I come at this from a counseling practice, so I think about the things that influenced me or served as a counter influence to me from the things that my parents believed. So I mean, for instance, for me, my father was a World War II veteran, and during the Korean War era, he served, and so obviously that had led to some effect on the way I saw the world, and perhaps in the way I saw it was one way, and perhaps the way other people saw their parents' experiences, it went a different way. So in this case, my point to you is that James Monroe's father was somebody who was angry at the British and felt like they were acting tyrannically. and therefore was in favor of the cause of American independence, as we would refer to it now. So James Monroe studied at Campbelltown Academy, which was in Washington Parish, which is a small place down in Virginia. And it's notable that this is a very small area where these Virginians who wound up being president, James Monroe, the last of them, grew up. This was kind of like a dynasty almost, not because they were all related, but people, for instance, people in New England were kind of resentful that our presidents kept stamping out American presidents down in the same area of Virginia. Now, I want to slow down and just talk about those kind of aspects of politics, because so many of the different sectional politics that they had back in those days are virtually identical to the ones we have now. I mean, as far as their sentiment is concerned, you know, one part of the country thinking that it's wagging the dog from the other part of the country, New England states feeling as though they're so upset about the way the Southern states are acting that they want to secede from the Union. Did you know that that New England wanted to secede from the Union? Yeah, well, I'm going to tell you about that. And that's something remarkable that I always learn when especially about American history, is that if, you know, we tend to look at politics today and we say, oh my goodness, this is like insane, right? You know, so somewhere there must have been a calmer time and where everyone got along and they weren't at each other's throats. Not necessarily. Yeah, I think that the normality is the vitriol between what is to become political parties in our country and different kinds of regional differences where one feels itself to be, I don't know, superior to the other. And a lot of those sentiments have not changed one bit. The only thing that's changed is technology, you know, and the ability to bring a 24/7 level of anxiety to us without relent, you know. So Washington Parish, where now this place where James Monroe studied at Campbelltown, right, in Washington Parish, that is also happens to have been the school where George Washington went, at least partially. You see, so geographically, you know, you have a lot of these overlaps between Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, et cetera, you see. And so George Washington went to the same school that James Monroe went to, right? I mean, James Monroe was younger, of course. Now, when Monroe's father died, right, Monroe was 16 years old, and he inherits the estate. Right, and then he went and he entered the College of William and Mary. But imagine him being a young student at William and Mary, right? And news comes that there have been these shots fired in a place called Lexington and Concord. Right, and I can only imagine what that's like. I mean, you know, you and I, we're used to, you know, it's this thing, right? And, you know, of course, I do current events all over the place. Like, as a matter of fact, tonight I have, right after this, I'm going to be immediately preparing for a focus, something called Focus on Contemporary Issues, right? Which I take just one or two things in the news cycle and talk about them for an hour to an audience. I'm going to be doing it in Darien. You see, so I'm constantly on this thing, watching the news, reading the news, et cetera, right? So you can imagine that back in James Monroe's day, you know, how long it took news to get from, I don't know, Massachusetts in this case, all the way down to Virginia, and how that news was carried, right? As part of our historical discussion is to actually go into the logistics of the day, right? I mean, today, I mean, I'm as I'm sitting here, I got all of these things popping up on my, you know, these news things popping up on my phone, I guess. So news comes that shots, typically what we call now the shot heard round the world, right? The Revolutionary War is essentially started. And how does James Monroe feel about this? So back in those days, apparently he felt like he couldn't not be a part of this. Which brings us to the next chapter in Monroe's story. So what happens is that James Monroe, now knowing that essentially whether they're calling it the Revolutionary War or not, there's obviously an insurgency against the British, and he wants to be part of it on the ground floor, James Monroe. So James Monroe with a bunch of other guys in 1775 raids the governor's arsenal in Williamsburg, Virginia. Imagine this. You and a bunch of other guys are going to now raid the property of the state of Great Britain, right, which is something that would get you shot or hung. I mean, it's an acts of insurrection, 100%, in the cause of patriotism. And so there is James Monroe breaking into and stealing from the arsenal of essentially the British government. And they make off with 200 muskets and 300 swords. And it was used to arm the Williamsburg militia. Now, this is pretty ballsy stuff, right? This is we're going to hang you stuff. But he didn't get hung because nobody got caught. And there's our James Monroe. Seems like sort of a brave fellow. And then in 1776, because he decides he wants to join the Continental Army in the cause of American independence, Monroe withdraws from William and Mary without a degree and goes and joins the Continental Army, which is now just being essentially formed together by George Washington. I mean, it was started as a ragtag thing, if you were part of my revolutionary program, we got into that a little bit more. So I don't know, this seems like a pretty brave start for our young James Monroe. What was the inspiration for people in the revolution, right? What back in those days made a country colonies that had it made under the rule of Great Britain. I mean, just think of it in a sense. We were protected. We had an army that we had the British protecting us with their army. We had the British protecting us with their navy. We enjoyed our crops and products being marketed to an entire worldwide network of British commonwealths, etc. We didn't have to worry about it. We didn't have to worry about Canada. We didn't have to worry about the French, right? I mean, we were even being protected from the Indians, you see. So what was it that inspired people out of this, I don't know, this kind of paternalism from Great Britain and made them feel this revolutionary fervor? I mean, to a large extent, the person who explained it best was one Thomas Paine, right? Common Sense, which for its day was a bestseller. There were like hundreds of thousands of copies of this thing printed, and it was recited in churches, in bars, in brothels, on street corners. Everybody was reading Thomas Paine's Common Sense. And it put together in a very simple fashion, a very layperson fashion, the reasons why what was to become the United States of America, then the British North American colonies, that we needed to separate from Great Britain and become our own country. And it can't be underestimated how this book had such an effect, right? It was very well written, very simply done. And it was, I take the time to explain this because one of the main discussions we have in today's politics is the understanding of something called populism. What is populism, right? Populism versus, I don't know, elitism, for want of a better phrase, you see? And this division, if you will, this differentiation has existed since day one, and in my opinion will always exist unless one side just literally annihilates the other, you know. But this duality is something that has always been part of the American character. And I have a couple of very small excerpts for you, right? Right. Thomas Paine, Common Sense. This is Thomas Paine. When my country, he says, into which I had just set my foot, right? Because he was actually an immigrant. When my country, into which I had just set my foot, was set on fire about my ears, it was time to stir. It was time for every man to stir. See, so this is what roughly you could call populism, right? And it was very moving. It was very moving, and it inspired enough people to literally understand something that they didn't understand before. They couldn't articulate themselves. And remember, this isn't exactly like everyone has satellite dishes on their roof, you know, back in those days. So you had to have word of mouth, and it had to go around and create this effort. In the case, of course, James Monroe and his ilk, they were already educated. But you know what? Most of the population couldn't read or write, right? And a lot of people are just common laborers or they're farmers. And so the common person really had to have these things actually orated to them. And of course, they can understand English in this case. And that, of course, is the biggest example of that kind of learning would have been from the Bible itself. Not that I'm making an overlap with these two things. I'm just using an analogy to show you the Bible is written in stories and parables, you know, especially for the purpose because we remember things in story form. Right? It makes sense. You don't have to know how to read or write to somebody tell you a story and have you comprehend concepts, you see. And Thomas Paine did that very, very well here. And here's another one. I wish I hadn't printed out a copy of the, or at least this part of the Old English, because the Old English, they switch, they have F's where like S's should be, and it always throws me off. So please bear with me. Thoughts on the present state of American affairs, right? This is from Common Sense. In the following pages, I offer nothing more than simple facts, right? This is at the beginning. Plain arguments and common sense. And I have no other preliminaries to settle with the reader than that he will divest himself of prejudice and I'll get back to that word, and suffer his reaction and his feelings to determine for themselves that he will put on, or rather that he will not put off, the true character of a man and generously enlarge his views beyond the present day. Right, so this goes on, and I got tripped up on one of those words like I told you about. And then I couldn't figure it out because I got embarrassed and then I got nervous. Okay, so there it is. And I'm going to get to another thing he wrote in a minute. Okay, because the second publication he had was something called the American Crisis. All right, now I'm going to get to that in a moment. So you had thousands and thousands of young men all around the colonies who were inspired by Thomas Paine to essentially join up with the Continental Congress, Continental Army, which was ill-fed, didn't have enough money to pay his troops, right? And until George Washington came along and others, had no organization. So we left off in 1776, where James Monroe has left William and Mary College, and he joins up with the Continental Army. So James Monroe's first action in battle in the Revolutionary War was when he took part in General Washington's attack on Trenton, New Jersey, on Christmas Day of 1776. Any of you seen that painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware with all of the ice and stuff? Now, here's an interesting point about James Monroe. Legend has it that James Monroe's in this boat with George Washington, right? It's like one of the guys in the back with, I don't know, fending off chunks of ice or something. It's not James Monroe, as it turns out. And but that is something that was widely accepted to be James Monroe. He wasn't in the boat with George Washington. So just a quick review about this, because this is a big deal. How is it that George Washington is crossing the Delaware on Christmas Eve? And why was that? And what was the significance of this? And it was an absolute desperate situation, one where there was nothing left to lose. Just a quick review on this. The revolution essentially begins in Boston, right? And like I said, I don't want to do the whole thing on the Revolutionary War, but a quick review is in order. I'm just trying to encapsulate it a little. You know, when people tell me, when I ask them, you know, what was the revolution about? And they say, well, we didn't want to pay our taxes. Now, it was a little bit more than that. You know, parts of it were we didn't want to pay our taxes, but it was a little deeper. Okay, that kind of makes us seem cheap and ungrateful, doesn't it? You didn't want to pay your taxes, right? Sounds bad now, and it sounded bad then. As a result of the French and Indian War, which happened before the Revolution, which we were on the side of the British, by the way, and it kind of cleared the mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, you know, places like where Ohio Valley was, of the French. Right, and drove the French up to Canada, up to Quebec, and down to like New Orleans, Louisiana. And as a matter of fact, George Washington fought on the side of the British in the French and Indian War. It's something that we don't really know much about, you know, unless we're doing a program on it. And that was very, very expensive for the British. It was a very expensive campaign for them. And they were broke. So they needed to raise revenue, the British did, fine. And what they decided to do was create a series of tax packages for essentially the North American colonies. And that created a lot of backlash because the North American colonies had been essentially left alone. You know, since the 1600s, we were able to do our own thing, you know, create our own legislatures and create our own laws. And govern ourselves, etc. And now all of a sudden you have Great Britain imposing all of these rules and regulations and taxes, which had this smack of being kind of punitive, you see. And first of all, they weren't taxing anybody else. They were just taxing the North American colonies in this regard. And there was no discussion allowed. When you had some pushback about the arbitrary nature of some of these taxes, then the British decided it was going to be their time to, shall we say, set an example, right? Because don't forget that Great Britain has all of these other colonies all over the world, right? And if these North American colonists are going to start pushing back, well, who knows what people in other colonies are going to start to do. So the British decided to use the North American colonies as an example, and they were going to essentially suppress any dissent. So they sent an army over, or a governor, to take over Massachusetts and impose kind of like a martial law in Boston area in Massachusetts. And the colonists pushed back. They didn't like it. They didn't like the way that they were being handled, right? There was no, of course, you had the famous no taxation without representation, and we were not represented in Parliament. So if we're going to be taxed, and that means that we're a body of people, maybe we should be represented in Parliament, you see, but we're not. We're just taxed. So we don't have any really authority over our own affairs anymore. We just taxed. And of course, that became an issue. And then there was this insult on top of injury flavor that this thing with Great Britain had with the colonists. And once again, this is up in Boston, where the British now came back with another series of taxes. And one of them, of course, included this thing with the tea, right? And the thing with the tea was that the British said the only tea that you can import to the colonies now is tea that is branded by the East India Company, right? The East India Company. So we are going to create a monopoly of the East India tea, and everyone in the colonies is forbidden essentially for buying any product by what we, Parliament, says that you can buy. You see, now, you might call this the beginning of the American character, right? We essentially turned around and gave the Parliament essentially the double-barreled middle finger. You know, you can't tell us what to do about like that. And everybody knew, and this is an important part, everybody knew that half the members of the British Parliament were stockholders in the East India Tea Company. And the East India Tea Company was on financial hard times, and it just so happens by imposing these taxes on the colonies and forcing us to buy their product is going to take the East India Company tea and turn a fantastic profit and take that entity out of near bankruptcy and make a fortune for half of the people in the Parliament who are forcing us by their laws to buy their tea, right? Now, this is what we refer to as corruption, political corruption, flat out political corruption. And we went down to Boston Harbor, and you may have heard about this, we tossed their tea into the harbor. You see? So it's not just that we didn't want to pay the taxes, it was the insult on top of the injury. It was asking us to pretend that this wasn't a blatant act of profiteering on the people who were actually making the laws that we were going to be forced to follow, right? That's what the beef was about. That's what the tyranny was about, you see? Anyway, the British are eventually driven out of Boston. They go back to Nova Scotia, and then they bolster up their forces, the British do, and they bring over like a whole nother army with them and a whole navy. And they're getting ready, and they're going to come and they're going to settle this thing once and for all, and they're going to make sure that the British have overwhelming force to put the colonists down this time. And everybody knows they're coming. And they do come. They come down to New York. The whole armada sails down to New York. And the important part about New York is that the New York has the Hudson River, right? Now, if you follow the Hudson River up, and let's say, for instance, you control New York City and you control the Hudson River, it will effectively, if you can think about a map in your mind, it will effectively split the colonies, right? So the rabble rousers, right, or all of these hotheads in New England, you see? If we can contain the hotheads in New England, right, it will effectively split the colonies, and then the British, can then separate us, you see? And then they can go down to the southern colonies and say, listen, you don't really want to secede, do you? Right? And they'll break the colonies in half. And once the British were going to get the southern colonies to say, well, I don't know what I was thinking. I was just a little angry, but I guess we want to stay all British, right? Then that would then isolate New England. That was the entire strategy of the British in the Revolution. So the British, that's why they land in New York. They land in Staten Island, actually. And we were expecting them to land in Manhattan, but they didn't land in Manhattan. They land in Staten Island. And then they actually bolstered their forces. They had a whole garrison there. And then when the British took their time and they were ready, they moved over to Long Island, where George Washington was. And they chased Washington out of Long Island. The British were hoping to, General Howe they were hoping to actually crush the revolution right there and the nascent Continental Army right there in Brooklyn. But what George Washington turned out to be an excellent strategist in is what's referred to today as strategic withdrawal, right? It's, in other words, we're going to get annihilated. Let's get the hell out of here, is what that means, you see? And you do it in a strategic fashion, that it's not that you're just running. It's not a route. You are retreating strategically. You're retreating to fight another day. And so George Washington takes his Continentals and he actually sneaks across the East River, right, from Brooklyn to Manhattan, which is remarkable that he didn't get caught, by the way. And but turned out that was something very good, that George Washington was excellent at, was like slipping out of the death grip of the British. And then right down to Manhattan, and then up through Manhattan, right? And there are two forts right over there that are still forts. Well, one of them is still a fort. Fort Washington and Fort Lee, which, as you may know, if you're from New York, that is where the George Washington Bridge is. And that is why the George Washington Bridge is called the George Washington Bridge. Fort Lee, which if you go over the GW, I mean, you wind up in Fort Lee, right? And so Washington Heights, right, is where the Manhattan side of the GW is. See, but it was Fort Washington. And then up a little further, you have Fort Tryon. I mean, all of these military spots had names such as these for real strategic purposes. Anyway, so Washington goes all the way up to White Plains, right, and then crosses the Hudson and comes back down for what's going to be the New Jersey campaign, right? And essentially, the British are chasing Washington and his whole damn army and James Monroe down through New Jersey, you see? And they wind up all the way down to the Delaware River by Philadelphia. And then on the other side, on the side of Philadelphia, right? And the Continental Army is in desperate condition. I mean, it's the winter, it's freezing. The Continental soldiers they have like 2 weeks left in their enlistment. And, any sane person is going to look around and say, like, who needs this? This is crazy. I'm going to go home, and not only am I going to go home, I'm going to first find the first British officer and tell them where Washington is. And then they're going the British are going to pay me off with some, 500 acres of land or something. You see what I mean? kind of like a Benedict Arnold sort of a thing. And it was hard to hold on under the circumstances. Why am I doing this? I'm going to be dead in a few days if I stay in this army. And for what? There was no food. There was no support from Congress. And George Washington, he cajoled people to stay, and he knew he had to pull an ace out of his sleeve, George Washington, for two reasons. Why? Because if he didn't do something to defeat the British, the people at the Continental Congress, were not going to get his attention. He had to show George Washington. George Washington had to show that he was winning this thing. And not only that, and very importantly, okay, you have nations that are on the other side of the Atlantic, like France, for instance. Is France going to recognize the new United States of America? I mean, listen, we have a whole declaration here. The declaration says that we've separated from Great Britain, but none of that means a thing unless some legitimate first world nation recognizes your country. Nobody had recognized the United States of America. You see, so the job of Great Britain was to crush us before another major nation recognized us as a legitimate nation. And George Washington had to show enough success that would inspire some other nation to say, hey, you know what? These people are actually being serious. They are going to win, or at least they're fighting hard enough, or they're competent enough, or they have their act together enough. That way, maybe we should recognize them as their own nation. You see, so it was really all on George Washington, whether or not this country was going to survive or it wasn't going to survive, like right there. And it was a desperate, desperate situation. He had to pull off something big, and he had to do it now, and he had to do it on a shoestring. But morale was at its lowest. People were like, I'm out of here. They're freezing. They don't have any shoes on. Now, you remember our friend Thomas Paine? Thomas Paine is with the colonists and Monroe in this winter across the river from Trenton, New Jersey, right? And Thomas Paine is there, and there's no bigger patriot or inspirational person than Thomas Paine. So Thomas Paine puts pad and pencil or whatever they used, and he writes his second piece called The American Crisis, right there. Right on his way down New Jersey, and he actually sneaks over to Philadelphia, right? Which is crawling with British people, by the way. He sneaks over to Philadelphia, right, being a major town, and he has thousands of these things printed, and it's called The American Crisis. And the American Crisis, in the 2 days before Washington's crossing the Delaware, the American Crisis is handed out amongst the Continental Army in this freezing, frigid winter. And this is read out loud to all of the troops for those who couldn't read, and read individually by those troops who could read. And the same way that Thomas Paine's common sense had inspired people to fight in the Revolution to begin with, the American Crisis was the shot in the arm that made the American troops, or the Continentals, rally and rededicate themselves to sticking with Washington, which turns into and made possible crossing the Delaware and defeating, of course, as you know, the Hessian troops at Trenton. Right, so here's the American crisis, right? I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. It's a whole thing, right? But you'll recognize the most important passage of it, right? See, so this wasn't handed to me at Valley Forge, but here you go. I'm just going to read you this one passage that inspired an entire army in the most desperate of circumstances. Thomas Paine, The American Crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. Now, you've heard this. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods. And it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. See how important Thomas Paine is? Right? I mean, it's kind of like, oh yeah, Thomas Paine, I've heard of him. Now, if it wasn't for Thomas Paine, we'd still be English, as far as I'm concerned. Thomas Paine was like the man on the spot. He who could take the sentiments that people might have been feeling and put them on paper and have it articulated in such a way that it wasn't full of big words. It wasn't coming from some kind of an intellectual angle that nobody understood, but intellectuals. It was populist. It was for the regular person. And it went straight for the heart. And if it wasn't for Thomas Paine, there would never have been a successful, in my opinion, there never would have been a successful campaign at Trenton, New Jersey, that Christmas Eve and Christmas morning of 1776. But Thomas Paine did write this, and people were inspired, and people stayed on. As a matter of fact, Washington he raided his own bank account. Then he actually bribed some of the soldiers with 10 pieces of silver each, right? And he says, just stay a little longer, right? Between that and Thomas Paine's The American Crisis, the army goes to cross the Delaware in 3 places, right? 2 places south of Trenton, 1 place north of Trenton. The 2 southern crossings are unsuccessful. The northern crossing, the one bearing George Washington and James Monroe, is successful. It's 3 hours behind schedule, but what the heck, right? They come down from the north on the Jersey side, and there's 2 accounts of this. Right, one account of this, and I don't know which is true, that's why I'm framing it like this. One account is that the German soldiers, right, the Hessians were Germans. They were mercenary soldiers hired by the British, right? They were German officers, right, and German soldiers. And so the one storyline is that they were partying because it was Christmas, and the general rule of fair is that everybody kind of takes a break during these things. And so they were partying, they were drunk, and the colonists showed up. George Washington shows up, and they're like, scattering about because they're drunk and they're surprised and they're sleeping off these hangovers, right? The other account is that they're actually high on alert. And even though the colonists came upon them, there was enough surprise element involved, and it was coordinated enough by George Washington, who was there, to actually be successful in vanquishing the Hessian force at Trenton, which was only the first of several campaigns that were right around this Trenton thing, right? Now, during this thing at Trenton, on Christmas Day of 1776, right? So leading one of the raids, right, on the assault on the Hessian troops at Trenton was one James Monroe. And during this action, he gets shot. James Monroe gets shot, and it's a serious wound. He gets shot through the lung, okay? And had it not been from a local doctor who treated him, he would have died of his injury right then and there. You see? He got treated by a local person, obviously, who was sympathetic to the colonist cause. And so a local doctor came up and treated James Monroe. I mean, I don't know what that entails. I mean, back in those days, I mean, you got a piece of lead that's gone solidly through your lung. I mean, I don't know what the treatment is for that, but our James Monroe suffered the rest of his life with this wound, you see? And I don't know, that's kind of a big deal. Now, the commander, by the way, just a fun fact about the Hessians, the commander of the Hessian troops, right? It was a German colonel whose name was Johann Gottlieb Roll, right? So I find that interesting, of course, because my name's Gottlieb. And he gets shot and he dies of his wounds. He dies. So that is our James Monroe's first action. And then the second thing that happened is the British, right, who are in New Jersey now, are of course enraged and embarrassed by Washington's ragtag army kicking the Hessians' butt, right, which is what happened. And the British are coming down and they're going to try to entrap us, you know, with the Delaware River behind us. And then so it becomes this series of flanking maneuvers where we essentially run up and actually take Princeton, you see, because the British are going to take their forces from Princeton and they're going to actually come down and try to get us, you know, in between Trenton and Princeton. But we do this end around maneuver, a flanking maneuver, which is another thing that Washington is very good at. And we actually take Princeton, you see, which is like now a double embarrassment to the British. And this whole thing goes through New Jersey, and essentially it drives the British all the way back to New York. It's unbelievable. And this is so critical because remember I was telling you that we, the colonists, were looking for enough competence being seen on the world stage where somebody on the world stage would actually say, hey, you know, these colonists have their act together. They're actually kicking the butts of the British here. And that's exactly what happened. And this is what inspired the French to actually recognize the United States of America as a legitimate, independent government. And then the French, not immediately, but eventually came to our aid. And if it wasn't for that, we never would have won, you see? So you see how these things hang together? It's pretty fascinating. And I'm just scratching the surface on this one. But our James Monroe was part of it. So therefore, That's why I take the time to tell the story. He was part of this campaign in this area. He also fights in, hang on, I wrote this down. The battles of Germantown and Brandywine, right? Now, Monroe was once again back with George Washington's army. There was another winter, cold, terrible winter at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 to 1778, right? And this was like the brutal winter at Valley Forge, right? And Monroe is there, freezing like everybody else at Valley Forge. Now, it's interesting that Monroe shared an accommodation, like a little cabin, right, during this winter with one John Marshall, who was a boyhood schoolmate of Monroe, and of course, it became a future Supreme Court justice. Right, just another interesting point. Any questions so far on this one? How are we doing? Anybody have any things that they're wondering about this part of the revolution? All right, that was an unknown phone call. I don't think I'm going to answer it. So now the revolution is eventually over. And what does Monroe do after the revolution? Right? So now let's look at this party system thing, which is so much part of James Monroe and what makes his legacy, and his political career, right? In the Constitution, there was never anything about political parties. But in our country, you know, as I was mentioning before, there was like almost right out of the gate, there were, you know, people who fell in one category of something and people who fell in the other category of something. And they were like, it was kind of like, you know, in Protestantism, if you've ever noticed, it's kind of like if you have these doctrinal differences, you just split off and make your own like little sub part of Protestantism, you know, and that was kind of like the trend here. The trend was, well, you know, we don't like what these states are doing, and we don't like what these states are doing. And of course, the biggest rift of all, and this is worth an entire like 5-part series, right? The biggest rift of all is that of what we refer to as Jeffersonianism versus Hamiltonianism. Right, and it is something that really manifests itself very much during the life and the political career of one James Monroe, and a lot of that, essentially, Camp A and Camp B, is the remnants of that existing in everything that's within our politics even today. You know, so Monroe was part of a group of people that was represented, or the leader of it was Jefferson, right? And these were the Democratic Republicans, right? The Democratic Republicans, right? And the other group of people were called the Federalists, right? Now, as we got to be careful with these terms, because even though these terms as nouns mean something, as verbs they're actually something else, or adjectives even, they're actually something else. And the meanings of these things change. Essentially what you have here is that the Federalists would have been roughly what we consider Democrats now, and the Democratic Republicans was what we would generally call the Republicans now. That is very, very imperfect. It doesn't quite fit perfectly, but you know, from the standpoint of just creating two, a 0 or a 1, right, a binary thing to compare one to the other, there you go. right? The Democratic Republicans represented through Jefferson this kind of notion that it's a very, very large country, and people in the different state governments should be governing themselves and should have the right to govern themselves. And people should have the right to not be messed with, right? And the purpose of government is to be as small as possible and to be as least intrusive as possible. And if we don't achieve that, then what was the point of the revolution, right? What was to become the Federalists under Hamilton, the general consensus there was, you know, to put a kind of like parody term onto it, we're from the government and we're here to help you, right? It is the central government should have as much power as possible, and your freedoms and your liberty is only going to be secured if the federal government is there to protect you from whatever, and even from yourself, you see? So, you know, in this kind of like crude way, you could parallel that out to right this minute, you know? The names have changed, the faces have changed, the technology has changed, but roughly you've got the same sort of thing, you know? You know, in our, what we refer to now as the flyover states, right, would be like in our example, what you would call the Jeffersonians, right? And the people who are in the elite population centers of the West Coast and the East Coast, certainly in New England, would be people you would consider Hamiltonians. So anyway, so James Monroe was somebody who was a follower and closely aligned, right, with Thomas Jefferson. And so there you have it. And that's where his sentiments lay. Now, Thomas Jefferson, after the Revolutionary War, was the governor of Virginia. And so what happens is that James Monroe, under Jefferson, gets appointed to be the military commissioner of the state of Virginia, you see? So he's aligned with Jefferson. Jefferson recognizes this, and he is essentially rewarded with this position in the Virginia government, right? So he's appointed, Monroe is appointed the military commissioner of the state of Virginia in 1780. And Monroe simultaneously is admitted to the Virginia State Bar in 1786. So he's in. Now, at this time, this is when the Constitution of the United States is being written, right? When the Revolutionary War was over, and soon thereafter, it became obvious that the agreement that was going to be between the fledgling 13 colonies, now 13 states, so we can actually run ourselves as a country, right? That was called the Articles of Confederation. And it was woefully inadequate, right? So the delegates were all sent back to Philadelphia to fix the Articles of Confederation, right? And they're all there, the whole gang, and they decided to scrap it and start from scratch. And the product was the United States Constitution. And that's how we wound up with the Constitution. Now, there was a problem with the Constitution from the standpoint of that it has to be ratified by different states for it to be accepted by all of the states. And all of the states didn't want to ratify it. And so therefore it was going to be a moot point. And then, this is a whole nother part of history that is actually, it's really red meat for people who are, interested in this aspect of things. If you've ever read the Federalist Papers, right, if you see some of the talking heads on television or some of these other people, I mean, everybody's always quoting the Federalist Papers, and that's the Federalist Papers were written to under pseudonyms to get people to understand why the Constitution of the United States is going to be good for all of the new 13 states and the rest of the states, presumably as we expand westward, you see. But many of the states, Virginia included, were very reluctant to sign on to a document that was essentially going to create another parliament. Right? I mean, didn't we just fight the Revolutionary War? And what was the purpose of that? If we're just going to, now that we've gotten rid of Parliament with their excesses of power, what we were calling tyranny, right? And we're going to now create the same things ourselves. And of course, the first answer to that is like, well, we're not going to do that. They did that. We're not going to do it. To which the answer comes, maybe you've noticed that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that includes you, because you're a person and none of us can help it. It just is what happens, right? And so to the Constitution, to convince the states that were like, I don't know if I want to give something called the federal government all of this power, right? Now you're saying that we're going to maintain our ability to govern our individual state, but like I said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And next thing you know, if it takes 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, 150 years, 200 years, the federal government's going to be telling us all what to do. So we're not signing. And that's what the Bill of Rights was for, which are otherwise known as the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, right? So that was the argument. The reason of the Bill of Rights, which is an addition, that's why they're amendments, is like, look, I'm telling you, the federal government isn't going to be getting in your junk, okay? And I'll prove it to you, because the 10th amendments that I'm showing you, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right? Guarantee against improper search and seizure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. See, this shows you that the 10 first amendments to the Constitution are going to ensure that the Constitution is going to limit the power of the federal government. There it is, the Bill of Rights, which is why it's called that, right? The government can't do this to you because you have these rights. So you don't have to worry about it, you see? So it was with the 10 amendments to the Constitution that the recalcitrant states actually said, all right, I still don't trust you, but I'm going to sign it. And there you have it. Now, why is this interesting? Because it's interesting. But besides the fact that it's interesting, okay, Monroe opposed the ratification of the United States Constitution. Now, I find that interesting, okay? So Monroe is like, no, I don't believe you. We're better off as Virginians just being Virginians, you see? Now, think about how strong this sentiment is, right? Think about how strong this sentiment is, right? If we were doing a program on the beginning of the Civil War, right? I mean, half the people who were, the Army officers and people in the Navy in the Confederate States, they were all like, geez, I'm sorry, but I'm going to resign my commission in the United States Army, right? See you later, because I really am, my heart is with the state of Virginia. You see, my heart is with the state of North Carolina, right? So this is a very, very strong sentiment, right? We don't even live in a world, I've never lived in a world where that was that much a sense of the state where you live as it being its own entity. By the time I was around, I think, the states were already subservient to the federal government. And certainly now, I mean, it's the states are all, I see that every state, Connecticut, New York, whatever state it is, are really just, we're just cogs in the federal wheel, and some people may disagree with me, but we're there to do what the federal government tells us to do. And if we don't do what the federal government tells us to do, they're going to take away our funding for this or take away our funding for that, notwithstanding the fact that we send the money to begin with. Okay. And you see, so it's what is going on back here. To me, there's a direct line right to the present moment, you see, in all of us. It's one of the reasons I love history so much. I mean, it's many of the people I speak to, maybe some of the people you talk to, they're like, well, what does that have to do with me? That happened such a long time ago. It's completely irrelevant, right? People didn't even have smartphones back then. How can this relate to me? You see, but it does. It does, especially in our comparison when we look at what's going on today in politics or anything. We put it in some kind of a context, and that context includes comparisons. And the comparisons is this mythical thing where we used to somehow get along or everyone agreed on stuff, and now we don't. My point to you is that I don't think we ever did. You see? Not that that's a bad thing, right? Another thing that the founding fathers did in the not the Declaration of Independence, but the Constitution, creating the balance of the separation of powers, was a state of constant antagonism between the different branches of government, where everybody was going to be covetous of their power. And even though we were going to be beating each other over the heads with ashtrays, right? I just threw that in. I don't know if they were ashtrays, right? And we were beating each other over the head in this fight, this food fight. The details of something would emerge and the balance would occur. It is a very, very contentious structure and was designed to be contentious. And somehow we have this notion that because we're all such genteel elites that we should sit around and just reach some consensus. That is actually not the way our system of government was designed. It was designed for some headbanging, and God knows we have it, do we not? Okay. Monroe opposed the ratification of the United States Constitution. However, Monroe did support the formation of a federal government under George Washington. You see, so our James Monroe supported the notion, right, of the formation of a federal government headed by a leader, and that leader was to be George Washington. What Monroe didn't want was the Constitution, you see. And remember back in these days, I mean, what does it say on a Connecticut license plate, right? Underneath, whatever your numbers are. The Constitution state. You see, every one of these states that were colonies had essentially created their own version of the Constitution, a constitution, which at least in part became the model of the federal Constitution. You see, so the point was, back in these days, it's like, well, who needs this duplication of government that is almost assuredly going to eventually usurp our own sovereignty, which I would argue has, almost completely happened, you see. So, we already have our own constitution. We already have our own elected officials. We already have our own department of whatever, and now we're going to ship out all of our sovereignty to some far off government by people who really don't understand us and don't care about what our values are or, what climate we're dealing with up here. You see, this goes straight back to the beginning, and Monroe was in the thick of it. Let's see. So Monroe becomes a senator in 1790. And then I'm just struggling with my own handwriting, if you'd forgive me. My note, you should see my handwriting from my note, my session notes, right from my clients, which I'm required by law to do after every session. The law says that I have to write the session notes. It doesn't say they have to be readable, right? So Monroe was elected to the Senate in 1790. And he becomes, watch this, George Washington, the president, appoints James Monroe to be the Minister of France. That's a pretty good gig, right? And Monroe was able to secure, listen to this, guess who's in prison in France that our James Monroe is able to negotiate the release for? Are you gonna like this? Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine is in prison in France. And James Monroe is able to negotiate his release out of prison. Now, I was thinking to myself, if I was you, I would be asking me, well, why was Thomas Paine in prison in France? Right. So I got the answer. Right. Okay. So when apparently Thomas Paine objected to the beheading of French King Louis XVI. Right. Don't forget that after the American Revolution was the French Revolution. Right. Remember that whole thing, the reign of terror, the guillotine, right? All the rest of that. And the guillotine, they weren't using that to slice up French bread, right? I mean, this was this massive bloody thing. It would make a good presentation, actually. And so it turns out that Thomas Paine objected to the beheading of the French King Louis XVI. And so the French revolutionaries threw Thomas Paine in jail. Right, because he had the nerve to stick his 2 cents in, apparently. And then James Monroe, as the ambassador to France, was able to secure his release. Actually, Thomas Paine remained in France for several years. Right, I don't know if I was him, I think I would have left. That would have been my ticket out of there. But Paine remained in France for several years, writing his last and most well-known work, the 3-part book called Age of Reason. So our James Monroe gets Thomas Paine, our hero, sprung from the who's gal, right? Now, George Washington recalls James Monroe from France. In other words, he gets fired as the foreign minister. Why? Because as a Jeffersonian, right, as a Democratic Republican, there is a policy now argument going on in the country. And Monroe sides with the Jeffersonians, which puts him against the policy of the George Washington administration, right? And the riff is over something called the Jay Treaty, right? So the Jay Treaty with England, right? Which is the Jay Treaty, I don't want to do a thing on the Jay Treaty. The Jay Treaty was this obscure thing where we negotiated with the British to try to fix the loopholes, for want of a better phrase, right? That was remaining from the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War, right? So we're already having like these trade disputes between the United States and Great Britain, right? So if you're an Anglophile, right, and you want to make nice with Great Britain, right, you're going to be, I don't know, kind of catering and being soft to Great Britain. But that becomes a problem because back in these days, if you're on the side of Great Britain, it means automatically you're not on the side of France. And there were a lot of people who rather be on the side of France than on Great Britain. You see, and this is a leftover from the Revolutionary War, and it's actually a precursor to the War of 1812, right? This is one little snapshot in time right there where our James Monroe is. You see, and it's something that never gets talked about. It's one of these like things that always this little point in time that gets lost in the cracks, and it's I don't know. It's kind of like right now, if you were to say that, well, we're spending too much money in Ukraine. You see, and we need to take care of some of our own stuff, or where's that money going, or something like that, right? Automatically people would say, oh well, you're on the side of Vladimir Putin, you see, and it's just this immediate kind of dissection into, unless you're supporting this, that means you must be supporting that, right? Now, whether that's true or not, or whether that's a fair analysis, I mean, it happens right now every single minute, right? And it was the same thing back in these days, except it was between Great Britain and France, right? If you're going to accommodate some kind of, I don't know, a maritime rule that is going to be non-confrontational with Great Britain, well, you must be on the side of Great Britain, which is not meant as a compliment, it's meant as an insult. And that automatically meant that you were hostile towards the French. Now, if you recall, those who were fighting in the revolution were pretty darn grateful to the French, you see. So now we have a generational difference of what's going on in the country. People like Monroe, even though he's not old yet, he's part of the last generation, right? He's part of the last generation that fought in the American Revolution. And they had certain sentiments and certain values that they felt were, that they weren't going to change for anything. You see, that's another thing that makes Monroe what makes Monroe. You see, it's kind of like I was telling you before earlier on, it's kind of like in the context of what did James Monroe learn from his father, whose sentiments were anti-British, right? Because of what was going on during what we call tyranny, right, before the revolution, right? And I remember, in this context of Monroe being the last of his generation, of this certain sentiment of being aligned with the French, it is like when the World War II generation is completely gone. Right now, I work in mostly around people between 85 and 95 every single day, right? And so believe me, I've watched a lot of people from that generation pass. And when I talk to people in that generation, I used to work with them professionally, even in my last career, when I was working on behalf of the Intrepid Foundation, interviewing hundreds of World War II veterans, Korean War veterans, Vietnam veterans, but specifically I'm talking about World War II veterans, right? So, there was a certain sentiment of those people back in those days, and this is what America is about, and this is what we believe in, and here's our values, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And, and they're all gone, and it's kind of like that whole genre of thinking, but the kind that I was so familiar to me as a young person, because so many of the people where I was around when I was younger were World War II veterans or Korean War veterans, right? And like today, if you're somebody who's that same age as I was then, they would not have any exposure to those particular sentiments, except perhaps there was some history program like this one, you see? And so for James Monroe, he's already looking at the French or the British from the lens of the people who fought in the Revolutionary War, you see? But the world is now growing up and it's changing, right? So we've won our freedom, right? And now we're a country, and now we're worried about lots of other stuff. We're worried about, the Louisiana Purchase. We're worried about the Canadians. We're worried about, the fact that the British are, they're grabbing our stuff from our ships off the coast, And so Are you going to align yourself with the British? If you fought in the revolution, probably not. You might better favor the French, right? Because the French were the ones who saved our hides, and they were the ones who were our allies against the damn British. You see, I mean, it's hard to be in the middle here. See, that's why I use that example, that provoking example, with the Russia Ukraine thing. I mean, it's like if you step in the wrong side of the line, the other side, it completely condemns you. I mean, that's what this was. I mean, if you were on the side of the British, then that meant that you, for the people who wanted to be on the side of the French, you were an anathema. See, and that created this. It's nothing less than a political partisan division in the country that existed right at that moment between the Federalists, who favored the British, and the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, who favored the French. Now, George Washington, as a matter of political, I don't want to use the word expediency, because that degrades the thought that went into it, but it was kind of like a practical consideration that Washington sided with the Jay Treaty, which favored negotiating and giving favorable terms to the British. You see, and it was one of these things that it was highly controversial. The Jay Treaty was highly unpopular, right? How many things have we seen in the last, I don't know, even in the last decade or so, that have gone through Congress or this or that, and it's like half the country thinks it's the greatest thing and didn't go far enough, and the other side of the country thought it was the worst thing that ever happened, right? That's what the Jay Treaty was. And Monroe favored the French, and the Jay Treaty, which Washington signed, was favoring the British, and that was the rift, and that is why Monroe was dismissed from his post by George Washington. And it really sets up. I left it here because this sets up, in a good way, the next chapter. It sets up the next chapter. You see the politics involved here, right? And we're going to lead right now into, in our next segment, we're going to lead into, I know I'm going to go into his second term, but Monroe's first term, rather, his first term, literally, he is swept into power as a result of what happens here with what I just told you, right? And what happens during the War of 1812, you see? And this is right at the brink of the War of 1812, is to occur right after this. And the Federalists were going to, the Federalists in New England, they had this thing called the Hartford Convention, where they wanted to break away. They wanted to secede from the Union, all of New England, right? It was like a continental convention, like we had in Philadelphia before the United States Revolution, or the colonial revolution, right? All of the different New England states held this constitutional convention in Hartford that was going to discuss breaking away from the rest of the United States, right? And these were led by the Federalists, you see? And it all had wrapped up around the War of 1812 and the policies there in abouts. And actually what happens here is the Andrew Jackson, right? Actually, technically after the War of 1812 is over, right? Which was signed at the Treaty of Ghent, right? And there are these British forces that are headed down through the Gulf of Mexico, and they're going to take New Orleans, right? And Andrew Jackson, they catch wind of this, and they set up these forces, and Andrew Jackson defeats the British. And Andrew Jackson turns out to be this big hero, right? and makes the entire point of what the Federalists were trying to do with their demands from Hartford ridiculous. Right, it's an event that happens down in New Orleans with Andrew Jackson that makes what the colonists are railing about, right? Not the colonists, rather, but the Federalists in New England are railing about. It makes it absolutely, it would seem ridiculous, right? Because now Andrew Jackson is this big hero, and the United States was right in what it did in the War of 1812. So whatever the New Englanders were angry about was nobody cares. And what happens is that the Federalist Party falls apart. And because the Federalist Party fell apart, James Monroe is elevated to the position of the presidency virtually unopposed by an opposing party. Well, I hope you had as much fun as I did with that. And so I will see you on April 19th. Okay.
Yep. Does anyone have any questions for Art before we go? Thank you, Art, for another wonderful session. The next session will be, as Art said, April 19th, that Wednesday at 2 p.m. If you missed any of this session or the last session, they will be available on our YouTube page. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and we'll see you all very soon.
Thank you, Art.
Thank you.
Well done.
Yep.
Bye-bye now.
Art. Thank you. Yep.
You're welcome.